All right, let's go. Number 10. The wall built against the sea. Winter storms on the Israeli coast stripped the sand off the seabed. In the shallows south of Haifa, at a drowned Neolithic village called Tel Hreiz, one of those storms uncovered a line of boulders lying 3 meters down, roughly 90 meters out from the modern beach. Ehud Galili had been diving that coastline for decades. He and his colleagues surveyed the stones and published the result in PLOS 1 in 20. The line ran for more than 100 meters. The boulders were rounded river cobbles, some of them a meter across, and the heaviest weighed close to a ton. That is the first problem. Rounded boulders of that size do not occur naturally anywhere on the shore. The nearest sources are the beds of the Oren and Gallam streams 3.8 kilometers to the south and 1.6 kilometers to the north. Every stone in the line was rolled-dragged or carried to the water's edge by people who had no wheels and no cranes. Behind it lies the village. Radiocarbon dates place it between roughly 7,500 and 7,000 years ago. This was a settled community that farmed, herded, hunted, and fished from one spot on the coast across several centuries. Houses, hearths, burials, the ordinary residue of people who intended to stay where they were. The wall does not enclose that village. It does not turn corners. It does not form a pen, and it does not work as a fish trap. It runs along one side only. That side faces the Mediterranean. But here is where the evidence stops being architectural and becomes climatic. Through those same centuries, the eastern Mediterranean was rising at roughly 4 to 7 millimeters a year. On paper, that is a slow number. Across one adult lifetime, it is 12 to 21 centimeters of extra water, arriving as winter storm surges that reached a little further inland each decade, salting the wells and undercutting the floors. The villagers could not have understood sea level rise as a process, and they did not need to. They could watch the beach moving toward the houses year after year, always in the same direction. So they built. Galili's team identified the structure as the oldest known coastal defense anywhere in the world, and its purpose is unusually legible for something this old. It has no second function. It faces one way. It was assembled from the heaviest material within 4 kilometers by a community of a few hundred people, against an enemy that never stopped, never varied, and never went home. It held for a time. Then it stopped holding. There is no destruction layer at Tel Hreiz. No burning, no weapons, no sign of panic. The village was simply abandoned. The sea closed over it, and the wall went under with everything else. The boulders now sit beneath 3 meters of water, because the thing they were built to exclude eventually crossed them and kept going. More than a dozen drowned Neolithic settlements are known along this stretch of the Carmel coast, at depths from a few meters to more than 10, which tells us the retreat was not one decision by one village. It was a coastline emptying house by house across generations. That is the unsettling part of Tel Hreiz, and it has nothing to do with the size of the stones. These people diagnosed the problem correctly. They identified the direction and built the only barrier their technology allowed. The engineering was sound. The effort was enormous. The answer was still no. The rate that drowned Tel Hreiz was 4 to 7 millimeters a year. Global sea level today is climbing at a measured rate inside the lower part of that same band. And the coast it is climbing is considerably more crowded than the one those villagers walked away from. The wall is still out there in the shallows, holding a line that stopped meaning anything 7,000 years ago. Number 9. Dún Aonghasa. On the western edge of Inis Mor, largest of the Aran Islands, the limestone simply ends. The ground runs out and drops close to 90 meters straight into the Atlantic. There is no beach below, no slope, and no approach. There is a cliff, and then open ocean, all the way to Newfoundland. Built onto that edge is a set of dry stone walls arranged in concentric semicircles, each one open at the drop. The innermost enclosure has walls up to 4 meters thick and 6 meters high in the restored sections, and no mortar was used anywhere in them. The stone came off the terraces below. It was stacked into the structure that has taken 12 centuries of Atlantic weather since its last major rebuild. Claire Cotter excavated the site between 1992 and 1995 for the Discovery Program's Western Stone Forts project. Radiocarbon results pushed the first serious occupation back to around 1100 BC in the Late Bronze Age, with further phases afterwards and a substantial reconstruction around AD. People lived up there. The excavations produced house foundations, hearths burials, and clay molds for casting bronze spearheads. Then, there is the thing lying between the walls. Across a band up to 30 meters wide outside the middle enclosure, the bare bedrock has been planted with thousands of limestone slabs. They are set upright and jammed into every natural crack, standing roughly a meter to a meter and a half tall, leaning at conflicting angles. They are packed so densely that a person cannot walk through them at speed, cannot see the ground between them, and cannot ride a horse into them at all. Military historians call this a chevaux de frise. The same idea appears at Iron Age hillforts in Iberia and in Wales, and it reappears much later in early modern siege warfare, where the obstacles are built from timber and iron. At Dún Aonghasa, the obstacle is the island itself. The mechanism is brutal, and it is not subtle, which is exactly the point of it. Attackers must slow to a walk. They must look down at their feet. They must pick a line through the stones, while whoever is standing on a 6-meter wall above them does whatever they intend to do. Rounded beach pebbles, the right size and weight for slinging, came out of the interior of the fort in quantity. Nobody up there was in any doubt about which direction the danger was expected to come from. The evidence boundary matters here, and it is worth stating once. No battle layer has been excavated at Dún Aonghasa. There is no mass grave, no burnt horizon, nothing at all tied to an assault. What survives is preparation rather than aftermath. The stones record an expectation serious enough to justify setting thousands of slabs upright in solid rock, and nothing in the ground tells us whether that expectation was ever tested. Something else has been testing the site continuously. The cliff has been retreating for the entire life of the fort. Storm waves on this coast lever blocks off the edge and throw them up onto the cliff top, and the outer walls run to the drop and simply stop, because the ground they once crossed is now on the seabed. The enclosures are semicircles today. They were almost certainly not semicircles when they were built. That leaves an uncomfortable arithmetic. We do not know how much of Dún Aonghasa the Atlantic has already taken, which means we do not know how much chevaux de frise once existed, or how much of it faced a direction that no longer exists, or whether the fort was ever the shape it now appears to be. Everything about the site that looks deliberate has been edited by the sea. The fort was designed to control one approach across land, and it did that well enough that the design was still worth rebuilding 2,000 years later. The approach it never controlled is the one that has been quietly eating it since the Bronze Age. Number 8. Crickley Hill. On a limestone spur above the Severn Valley in Gloucestershire, the excavation trenches kept producing the same object. Flint arrowheads, leaf-shaped, finely pressure-flaked, unmistakably early Neolithic in date. They came up in the hundreds, and they were not scattered evenly across the site. They clustered at the gateway, and they clustered in the burnt material. Philip Dixon directed 25 seasons at Crickley Hill between 1969 and 1994, which makes it one of the most thoroughly excavated prehistoric sites in Britain. The Neolithic sequence he uncovered runs through the middle centuries of the 4th millennium B. It is a sequence rather than a single event, and that is what makes it useful. The first phase was the causewayed enclosure. 2 lines of interrupted ditches cut across the neck of the spur with banks of quarried limestone piled behind them. Some 70 or 80 of these enclosures are known in Britain, and they are not obviously defensive. The gaps between the ditch segments are frequent and wide. The ditches themselves are shallow, and across southern Britain, the sites were used for gathering feasting deposition and the handling of the dead. They read as meeting places with a boundary, not as fortifications. We also know now how suddenly they arrived. The Gathering Time program, published in 2011 by Alastair Whittle, Francis Healy, and Alex Bayliss, applied Bayesian statistics to hundreds of radiocarbon dates and compressed the whole phenomenon into a startlingly narrow window. Causewayed enclosures appear in southern Britain in a rush across a few generations. In the 37th and 36th centuries BE, and most are out of use again within 200 or 300 years. Whatever they were for the need for them came and went quickly. At Crickley, the ditches were filled, recut, and refilled repeatedly through that period. Then, the character of the site changed. A new ditch was dug larger than the earlier lines, and continuous rather than interrupted. The bank behind it was revetted with dry stone walling and topped with a timber palisade. The entrances were narrowed to controlled passages. Whatever the first enclosure had been for the second was built by people who had decided that the interruptions were a mistake. It burned. The palisade burned. The gate structures burned, and the arrowheads lie in the entrance passageway and against the charred timber, which is precisely where they would fall if the fighting concentrated on the way in. After that, the Neolithic occupation of Crickley Hill Tulsa ends. What makes this hard to dismiss is that Crickley is not alone. At Hambledon Hill in Dorset, Roger Mercer's excavations found outworks whose timber-laced ramparts had been stormed and burned along a stretch of some 200 meters, with human skeletons in the charred collapse and leaf-shaped arrowheads among their ribs. The dates fall in the same few centuries. Two sites, two burnt boundaries, the same weapon type in the same position in the ground. The interpretive limit is real and should be stated once. Fire can be deliberate closure rather than assault. Arrowheads can accumulate through hunting or through ritual deposition, and archaeologists have argued every one of those positions in print. But at Crickley, the burning the arrowheads, the concentration at the entrance, and the permanent abandonment all occur together. In one horizon, in a structure that had already been rebuilt to be harder to walk into. That combination is what makes the site disturbing rather than merely interesting. Britain's first farming communities had been on the island for only a handful of centuries when this happened. The picture that used to accompany them of quiet woodland clearance and communal monument building by people with no enemies does not survive contact with a torched gateway and hundreds of arrowheads. The most haunting detail at Crickley Hill is what the excavators never found. There are no bodies in the burnt gateway. Nobody was buried where they fell. Nobody was recovered and interred nearby, and no cemetery of the defeated has ever appeared anywhere on the hill. Whoever held that wall left the site or was carried off it, and the spur then stood empty. An Iron Age hill fort was raised on the same ground more than 2,000 years later by people who can have had no idea what was underneath them. The Neolithic never came back to Crickley Hill. Number 7. The oldest town wall in the world. In 1952, Kathleen Kenyon cut a trench into the western flank of a mound in the Jordan Valley and began removing the accumulated debris of the oldest continuously occupied settlement anyone had found. John Garsting had dug there in the 1930s and reached a stone wall he believed belonged to the second millennium B. Kenyon went deeper, and the dates went sideways. The wall she exposed at the base of the sequence was built around 8000. The site is Tel es Sultan at Jericho. The pre-pottery Neolithic, a settlement covered a few hectares beside a permanent spring, and the people in it were among the first anywhere to combine cultivated cereals with year-round residence in one place. They had no metal, no pottery, and no writing. What they had was a wall 3.6 meters high and 1.8 meters thick at the base, cut from stone and carried around the settlement. Set into it was a solid stone tower more than 8 meters tall, with 22 steps running up through its core. Outside the wall, Kenyon recorded a ditch cut into the bedrock itself. For most of the 20th century, the interpretation was straightforward. The story wrote itself. The world's oldest town had built the world's oldest defensive wall, complete with the world's oldest watchtower, which meant organized violence was already old by 8000. The problem is what the wall does and does not do. In 1986, Ofer Bar Yosef published an alternative reading in the journal Current Anthropology, and it turns on the wall's own geometry. The thickness is not consistent. On the western side, where the ground rises toward the hills, the wall is around 3.5 meters thick. Elsewhere, it thins to 1.4 or 1.6 meters. That is less than half as strong. A wall built against attackers has no reason to be more than twice as strong along one arc, unless the attackers can be relied on to always come from the same direction. A wall built against something that flows has every reason. The western side is the uphill side. Above it are wadis draining the Judean hills, and the deposits around the settlement record what came down them. Bar Yosef pointed to alluvium, filling the associated ditch. He pointed to stream erosion that had removed the wall completely along one edge of the Tel. And he pointed to a settlement sitting on a sloping fan exactly where seasonal floodwater and mud would arrive. On that reading, Jericho's wall is not a fortification at all. It is a flood barrier built by farmers protecting stored grain and mud brick houses from their own hillside. And its enemy was water and silt. The truly unsettling part is that the argument has never been settled in either direction. We have no destruction layer under the wall, no weapons cache, no burnt gate, none of the evidence that makes the case at Crickley Hill or at Hamoukar. There is also no reason a flood barrier would need a stone tower 8 meters high with an internal staircase. That is a strange thing to attach to a levee. Later work has multiplied the possibilities rather than narrowing them. Rand Barkai and Roy Lee Rand modeled the local topography. At sunset, on the summer solstice, the shadow of the nearby mountains falls first on the tower, and then spreads down across the settlement below it. They argued the structure was built to concentrate attention and authority in a community that was learning for the first time to live permanently in one place. Others read the tower as ritual or as storage, or as a monument to labor that could now be commanded from people tied to fields. Estimates put the tower alone at something like 11,000 working days. So the oldest wall ever found around a human settlement is also the least explained. It is unambiguous about its own existence and completely silent about its purpose. 11,000 days of quarrying, hauling, and stacking went into a structure whose intended enemy is still a live academic dispute. 70 years of excavation have widened the range of answers rather than closing it. The people who built it knew exactly what they were keeping out. They are the only people who ever have. Number 6. Liangzhu. Between 2009 and 2015, survey teams working the wetlands northwest of Hangzhou in eastern China traced a set of low earthen ridges through rice paddies and bamboo. Local maps treated them as natural landforms. Coring and radiocarbon dating showed they were nothing of the kind. They were dams, and they were built between roughly 5,200 and 4,800 years ago. Bin Liu and colleagues published the analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 20. The system contains high dams in the valleys of the northern hills, low dams, and long levees on the plain below, and a network of canals, ditches and moats running to about 30 kilometers. The largest single element, the Tangshan levee, runs at least 5 kilometers, measures 20 to 50 meters wide, and stands 2 to 7 meters high. Building it meant moving an estimated 2.88 million cubic meters of earth. The authors put the labor at something like 3,000 people working for 8 years. They dated the enterprise more than 1,000 years before the first Chinese dynasty that later texts bothered to record. Behind the barriers sat Liangzhu City. The walled core covers around 3 square kilometers, expanding past 6 with the outer city. This was a genuine urban center. It had a raised palace platform, workshops, granaries, and elite cemeteries producing some of the finest jade ever carved anywhere. One granary deposit alone held a vast quantity of carbonized rice. Nobody in the region had built anything comparable before. The barriers were not built against people. The lower Yangtze is a delta landscape. It floods from the hills during the summer monsoon and from the sea during typhoon surge. A city of that size, sitting on soft alluvium, is a target for both. The dams and levees enclose a protected zone of nearly 100 square kilometers. The reservoirs behind them are large enough that the calculated storage runs into billions of cubic meters. That turns a destructive seasonal pulse into a manageable one, and incidentally floats timber and cargo along canals into the heart of the city. This is the oldest large-scale water control system known anywhere. It predates the earliest comparable works in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was built by a society with no bronze, no deciphered writing, and no state that later history remembered. The engineering shows how precisely the problem had been understood. Sections of the embankments were raised from bundles of river mud wrapped in reeds and grasses, then stacked like sandbags. That reinforces soft fill and lets a large barrier go up fast. That is a technique for people who already know exactly how much time they have before the water comes back. Liangzhu lasted roughly 7 centuries behind those walls. Then it ended. In 2021, Highway Zhang Christoph Spottel and colleagues published an isotope record from stalagmites in 2 caves to the southwest in the journal Science Advances. It registers a period of extremely high precipitation between about 4,345 and 4,324 years ago. Humid conditions then returned intermittently for another 3 centuries. A thin layer of clay lies over the preserved ruins of the city. That is an extraordinary piece of convergence, and we can line the two archives up to within a couple of decades. The archaeology says the city was abandoned around 2300 BC and sealed under water-laid sediment. The cave record from a completely independent source says the monsoon delivered roughly 20 years of exceptional rain at the same moment. The most cited conclusion is that the Yangtze and its tributaries produced flooding on a scale the dams could no longer hold. The system was not defeated by bad design. It was defeated by a number outside its design range, which is a different kind of failure, and a far more familiar one. The ridges are still in the landscape. Farmers grew rice on top of them for centuries, without knowing what they were standing on. The modern reservoirs in those same valleys sit close to where the Neolithic ones were placed. The hydrology has not moved. The water still comes off the same hills. Liangzhu solved a problem that has never gone away. The solution outlived the people who designed it by 4,000 years, and in outline it is still the solution used there today. Number 5. The wall that came down under sling fire. Around 3,500 BC, in what is now northeastern Syria, near the Iraqi border, a large town was attacked, overwhelmed, and burned. The event lasted a very short time. It left one of the clearest snapshots of organized violence anywhere in the archaeological record of the ancient Near East. The site is Hamoukar. Excavation ran as a joint Syrian-American expedition from 19. It was directed first by Maguire Gibson and then by Clemens Reichel of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, working with Syrian co-directors, including Salam al-Kuntar. What the 2005 and 2006 seasons exposed was not a gradual decline. It was a mud brick wall lying on the ground where it had been knocked down with the weapons still in the rubble. More than 2,300 clay sling bullets were recovered. They are egg-shaped, hand-formed, about the size of a plum. They turned up at every stage of their existence, unfired and drying in rows, stacked ready for use and buried in the debris of the collapsed wall. One had punched through the plaster facing of a mud brick wall and stopped inside it. A sling bullet is a cheap weapon that demands an expensive skill. It also demands numbers. 2,000 of them, concentrated at one wall in one destruction horizon, is not a raid and not a feud. That is a force which arrived with prepared ammunition in quantity, intending to take a fortified place. The defenders answered. Among the collapse inside the walls, the excavators found bullets that had been gathered up and stacked to be thrown back. And Reichel described the impression as people throwing quite literally everything they could find at the attackers. About 24 were lined up neatly along the edge of a shallow pit, ready to hand. It did not work. The assault was brutal, and it was fast. 2 large administrative buildings burned. Structures fell in on themselves, sealing rooms under collapse with their walls still standing to shoulder height. 12 burials were cut into the debris afterwards, most likely casualties of the fighting. What makes this significant is where Hamoukar sits in the sequence of human settlement. This is northern Mesopotamia in the late Chalcolithic. It is centuries before writing, before the wheel is common, before anything anyone would call a kingdom. The conventional model held that complex organization and the warfare that comes with it radiated northward later from the great southern cities. Hamoukar contradicts that in the simplest possible way. It was already a substantial urban center, with administrative buildings, mass-produced pottery stamped seals carved as animals, and a wall worth the trouble of knocking down. and the layer immediately above the destruction is dominated by material from the south, from the Uruk world of Lower Mesopotamia. The evidence boundary here is important. Pottery style is not a signature. A change in ceramics above a destruction layer does not prove who lit the fire. And Reichel and his colleagues have been careful to present the southern connection as the leading hypothesis rather than a demonstrated fact. What we can say for certain is narrower and still remarkable. A northern town was stormed. The people who stormed it came equipped for the job. Different material culture occupied the site afterwards. The other thing worth holding on to is what the town had that made it worth taking. Obsidian is the sharpest cutting edge available before metal, and it comes out of a small number of volcanic sources. Hamoukar sits on the route between those sources in Anatolia and the plains to the south. Survey around the site identified an enormous obsidian working area, a landscape of debris left by tool production on something close to an industrial scale. Walls tend to go up around whatever is scarce, valuable, and portable. So do armies. The bullets themselves are the most direct thing to survive. 55 centuries later, they are still small lumps of river clay, shaped by hand in an afternoon by people who expected to need them soon. And they outlasted the wall, the town, and everyone inside it. Excavation at Hamoukar was suspended when Syria's own war closed the country. The mound now sits in a landscape that has been fought over again inside living memory, which is a disturbing footnote for a site whose entire archaeological value is one afternoon of violence in 3000. Number 4. La Bastida. In September 2012, a team from the Autonomous University of Barcelona announced what they had uncovered on a hillside near Totana in Murcia in southeastern Spain. They had spent several seasons clearing a slope at a site dug intermittently since the 19th century. What emerged did not fit anywhere in the accepted sequence of European prehistory. 6 towers stood along a 70-meter stretch of wall. The wall itself was 2 to 3 meters thick and originally 6 or 7 meters high. The towers were solid and square-based, spaced roughly 4 meters apart, standing around 7 meters tall. The perimeter ran to about 300 meters around a settlement of 4 hectares on a steep hill between 2 ravines with one narrow approach. The construction dates to around 2000. That number is the whole problem. At 2200 BC, the Iberian Peninsula is at the beginning of the Archaic Bronze Age. Nothing in continental Europe at that date looks like this. Closely spaced projecting towers are a solution to a specific tactical problem. They are arranged so that defenders on one can cover the base of the next. And the accepted history of that solution runs through the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East centuries later. 4 meters is very close spacing. It leaves no dead ground at the foot of the wall, which is the one place an attacker has to stand in order to work at it. Then there is the gate. Set into the wall, the excavators found a secondary entrance, a postern preserved almost intact. It is roofed with a pointed arch, and it is the first pointed arch passage recorded anywhere in prehistoric Europe. The same feature turns up at Troy and in the Levant. It does not appear in Bronze Age Spain before this, or after it anywhere except here. Except that where the idea came from is genuinely contested, and it deserves to be. The team was led by Vicente Lull, with Rafael Mico Cristina Rehuete and Roberto Risch. They proposed that the techniques arrived rather than developed, carried west by people moving after upheaval in the Eastern Mediterranean around 4,200 years ago. Architectural resemblance is a weak instrument for tracking populations, and we should treat it as one. No genetic study has yet demonstrated an Eastern Mediterranean movement into Archaic Mercia at that date. The alternative explanation is convergence, the same tactical problem producing the same answer independently, because there are only so many ways to defend a slope. Iberia also had a fortification tradition of its own to build on. 1,000 years earlier, at Los Millares in Almeria, Copper Age communities had already raised concentric walls with semicircular bastions and set outlying forts on the approaches. The idea of enclosing a settlement against organized attack was not new in the peninsula. What is new at La Bastida is the sophistication. Either way, the defensive intent is not in doubt, and neither is the scale of what the community expected. The settlement also held a reservoir behind a 20-meter dike with capacity approaching 400,000 liters. Towers and a water supply are a matched pair, and the pairing is the most revealing thing on the site. Towers stop an assault. A reservoir is for surviving a siege, which means being surrounded, cut off and waited out. That is an idea about warfare, rather than an idea about fighting, and somebody at La Bastida already had it. Inside the wall, the houses were substantial, some more than 70 square meters. The archaic world buried its dead beneath the floors of their own homes in jars and stone cists. The graves of a small elite carry weapons, silver, and gold. The majority carry almost nothing. This was a stratified society, producing arsenical bronze, controlling a landscape, concentrating perhaps 1,000 people behind a single line of stone. La Bastida was abandoned before 1500 BC, along with the wider archaic system, and that collapse was regional rather than local. Nothing on this scale was built in the area again for a very long time. Whatever the towers were answering, the answer left with them. And that is the extraordinary thing about this wall. The pointed arch at La Bastida is still the only one of its kind in prehistoric Europe. After the passage was sealed, nobody in Iberia built another for something like 2,500 years. The tactical arrangement it belonged to had to be worked out again from nothing by people who had never heard of the place. Number 3. Crow Creek. In 1978, erosion on a bank of the Missouri River in South Dakota began exposing human bone. The site was a fortified village of the initial coalescent tradition, ancestral to the Archaea occupied in the middle of the 14th century A. Robert Alex, the state archaeologist, and Larry Zimmerman of the University of South Dakota led the recovery. The bone was not in a cemetery. It was in the fortification ditch. The final count taken from right temporal bones reached at least 486 individuals, men, women, and children. They had been put into the ditch in places to a depth of 4 feet, left exposed long enough for scavengers to reach them, and then covered over. Around 90% of the skulls carry cut marks consistent with scalping. The rest of the assemblage documents mutilation, running well past killing decapitation, removal of hands and feet, broken teeth, cuts at the base of the tongue. The village itself, at least 55 earth lodges had been burned. It is a horrifying assemblage by any standard, and the physical anthropology of it has been worked over for decades. But here is where the site stops being a massacre and becomes something harder to look at. Crow Creek had been fortified for some time already. There was an older dry ditch and bank around the original village. And at the moment of the attack, the community was in the middle of replacing it. A new longer fortification ditch was being dug to enclose an expanded settlement. And it was not finished. The dead were put into the unfinished section. That single fact reorganizes everything else on the site. These people knew. They were not surprised by the possibility of attack. They had already been living behind a wall and had decided that the wall was no longer adequate. And they had committed a large share of the village's labor to enclosing more ground. More ground means more people had moved in, which means the pressure was visible from inside the village and had been visible for a while. The construction schedule and the attack simply did not line up. We can read the reason for that pressure directly off the skeletons. They carry cribra orbitalia and parodic hyperostosis, both linked to chronic anemia and nutritional stress, along with Harris lines, recording repeatedly interrupted growth. This population was shorter than their Archaea descendants. They were hungry over years, in a period when the northern plains were subject to climatic swings that could put maize agriculture along the Missouri under real strain. The wider context fits. The initial coalescent villagers had moved north into the Missouri Trench from the Central Plains, into a valley that was already occupied, and competition for the best bottomland was the likely consequence. Fortified villages multiply in this region in exactly this period. Crow Creek is the extreme example of a pattern, not an isolated event. The demographic profile carries one more anomaly. Adolescent and young adult women are underrepresented among the dead relative to what a whole community should contain. The most cited explanation is that they were taken. It cannot be demonstrated from the bones. and it remains an inference drawn from an absence, which is the weakest evidence there is, and also the only evidence available. The truly disturbing part of Crow Creek is not the fore. It is the ditch. Somebody surveyed that line. Somebody organized the digging, moved the earth planned where the bastions would sit, and expected to finish the job before it was needed. The wall that was supposed to keep the attackers out became the container that held the dead because it was the only excavation on the site large enough to take them. The people who dug it were buried in it by whoever came back afterwards, in a trench they had cut themselves and never got to close. It is not a detail you can unknow once you have seen the site plan. The remains were studied and then reburied in 19, at the request of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe, on the ground where they were found. The unfinished ditch is still in the ground under the grass. So is the length of it that was never dug. Number 2. The citadels that prepared for a war nobody recorded. The wall at Tiryns in the Argolid in southern Greece is built from limestone blocks that individually weigh several tons. In places it is more than 7 meters thick. The circuit at nearby Mycenaean runs close to 900 meters and stands almost 12 meters high, where it survives. Both sites are threaded with galleries and casemates, roofed in corbelled stone that has not moved in 3,000 years. Classical Greeks looked at this masonry and concluded that no human being had laid it. Pausanias records the explanation. Current, in his own day, the walls were built by the Cyclopes. The term stuck. Cyclopean is still the technical word for the style. The people who actually built it were Mycenaean Greeks, and they were not a mysterious lost race. They kept administrative records in Linear B ran palace economies with taxation and rationing, traded across the eastern Mediterranean, and left inventories of chariots, textiles, and bronze. They are documented. What they were afraid of is not. The building sequence is where the pressure shows. Mycenaean's fortifications went up in stages. Around 1250 BC, the circuit was extended and rebuilt, and the Lion Gate was set into it with a threshold block over 4.5 meters long. Then, close to 1200 BC, a further extension pushed the wall out across the northeastern corner of the hill for a single reason. The citadel had no water inside it. Engineers drove a corbel vaulted passage down through the rock in 3 flights, to a depth of over 15 meters. That is below the level of the walls. It reaches a cistern, fed by tunnel, from a spring on the slope above. Tiryns received comparable underground galleries to its own water supply in the same period. That is not general improvement. A hidden cistern is built for one situation, and one only being surrounded for long enough that thirst becomes the deciding factor. The work was not confined to the citadels either. In 1966, Oscar Bernier published a Cyclopean wall running across the Isthmus of Corinth. It was traced for around 2 kilometers, built in the same masonry, up to nearly 6 meters wide, with small projecting towers along its northern face. The pottery dated it to the very end of the Bronze Age, around 1000. Bernier read it as a barrier thrown across the only land route into the Peloponnese, and he noted that it may have been left unfinished. What makes this so striking is how consistent it all is. Thickened citadel walls, hidden water, and a line across the neck of the land, inside the same few decades. At Pylos, the Linear B archive includes a set of tablets that some scholars read as dispositions of watchers posted along the coast. That would put lookouts on the shore at the same time the masons were on the walls. Then the palaces burned. Between roughly 1200 and 1180 B.C., Mycenae Tiryns, Pylos, and most of the major Mycenaean centers were destroyed or abandoned in a short span. Linear B stopped being written because the bureaucracy it served no longer existed. Population in the Argolid fell sharply. Greece entered several centuries in which nobody built in stone at that scale, and nobody wrote anything at all. It is one of the most complete collapses of a literate society anywhere in the record, and it is frightening in a way. The masonry is not. Bronier's own explanation, an invasion by Dorian Greeks from the north, no longer commands support. 60 years of subsequent work has produced a range of candidates for the collapse of the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age. drought recorded in pollen and isotope archives, earthquake damage, the breakdown of long-distance trade in tin and copper, internal revolt, the movement of displaced groups that Egyptian sources record as the Sea Peoples. Most researchers now favor several of these acting together. No single enemy has ever been identified in the archaeology of the Argolid. So the walls remain the clearest statement these people ever made, and it is a haunting one. The Mycenaeans had writing, and what they chose to write down was sheep counts and chariot wheels. Nothing in the tablets names the thing that made them move a mountain of limestone and sink a staircase 15 meters into solid rock. The masonry is still standing at Tirans, 7 meters thick, pointed outward across an empty plain. Number 1. The city that put jade inside its walls. For decades, the stone rubble running along the ridges of northern Shaanxi near the edge of the Ordos Desert was assumed to be a ruined stretch of the Great Wall. It is in the right landscape, and it looks the part. Villagers had been pulling jade out of the stonework and selling it for a century, and that jade was assumed to have been hidden there later by somebody else. Systematic excavation began in 20. The rubble was not the Great Wall. It was more than 2,000 years older. The site is Shimao, and it is the largest known Neolithic settlement in China. At its height, it covered about 400 hectares, with inner and outer stone circuits running to roughly 10 kilometers in total. They were reinforced with bastions, gatehouses, and rectangular projecting platforms of a type Chinese military architecture would not use routinely for another 2,000 years. It was occupied for around 5 centuries, from roughly 2,300 BC, and then it was abandoned. Nothing in the accepted account of early Chinese civilization predicted it. That account ran through the central plains along the Middle Yellow River and treated the northern frontier as a place that received culture rather than making it. Shimao sits on that frontier, fortified on a scale with no rival anywhere in China at that date. At the center stands a stepped platform about 70 meters high, built up in tiers faced with stone. On top of it sits a palatial precinct with its own reservoir and craft workshops. Zhou Yongsun and Jing Shao of the Shanxi Provincial Institute of Archaeology published the excavation of the site's core in the journal Antiquity in 20, with Li Zhang of Zhengzhou University and Min Li of UCLA. The stonework itself is where Shimao becomes strange. Thousands of pieces of jade were deliberately wedged into the gaps between the blocks, not buried in tombs, not laid in a foundation deposit and covered over, inserted into the fabric of the walls and terraces at intervals as the construction went up. Dark green and near black blades discs and knife-shaped pieces, worked from material with no local source, carried in from a considerable distance at real cost, and then walled into masonry where nobody would ever see them again. Jade in early China is not decoration. It is the substance associated with authority, with ancestors, and with the boundary between the human world and whatever is on the other side of it. A community that puts its most valuable and most sacred material inside a wall is not paying for the wall. It is arming it. And then there is the East Gate. Beneath the wall foundations at the outer eastern entrance, the excavators found 6 pits containing around 80 human skulls. No accompanying skeletons. The heads had been removed and deposited on their own, several showing blunt force damage and burning with the 2 pits closest to the gate, holding 24 each. Analysis indicated the victims were overwhelmingly young women, and the leading interpretation is that they came from a rival group killed in connection with the construction of the wall itself. The evidence boundary is worth stating plainly. Skulls in a foundation pit demonstrate that people were killed and deposited there. They do not on their own prove the intention, and no text survives to tell us what it was. What the excavators can show is the association. Heads under the threshold laid down as the gate went up. That is the arrangement at Shimao. Human heads beneath the entrance. Jade inside the stone. Carved stone panels of serpents and part human faces set into the gate structure, and eye motifs worked into the platform above. The engineering answers a physical threat, and that threat was real. Shimao's walls, bastions, and baffled gates are a response to armed attack. A fortified settlement of 400 hectares is not built by a society at peace with its neighbors, But defensive architecture on its own does not require jade sealed invisibly into the masonry. It does not require 80 severed heads beneath a gateway or monsters carved to face outward at whatever was coming. The truly extraordinary thing about Shimao is that both systems run through the same wall, built at the same time, by the same hands. One layer is engineering. The other is aimed at something the engineering was not expected to handle. We can measure the first layer precisely. Wall thickness gate. Design sightlines. 10 kilometers of circuit, the number of skulls, the weight of the jade. Every physical fact is recoverable. The reasoning is not. Nobody at Shimao wrote anything down. The culture that built it left no descendants who explained it. And by the time Chinese texts begin, the city had been empty and forgotten for 1,000 years. Around 1800 BC, the population left at a point when the northern climate was turning colder and drier. The walls stayed where they were. Villagers eventually built their own houses out of them and dug the jade out of the joints without ever asking what it had been doing in there. That is the pattern every wall on this list shares, from the boulders off the Carmel coast to the ridge above the Ordos. The stone survives. The fear that shaped it survives too, in the thickness, in the geometry, in the direction the thing faces. And you can still read all of that off the ground with a tape measure. The reason does not survive. 10,000 years of people moving enormous quantities of rock and earth to hold a line, and in almost every case, we can prove exactly how frightened they were, and we cannot prove what of. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.